Good evening, everyone. If I might have your attention, please. Thank you very much for coming this evening. For those of you whom I've not met, I'm Kevin Broderick, the chair of RPA, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And on behalf of the board of RPA, I'd like to just say thank you for coming this evening. We know this has been a especially difficult week for everyone in the tri-state metropolitan area, so your presence tonight is greatly appreciated. I might also add, just as a reminder, as the calendar year wanes and you formulate your giving thoughts for the year, please keep in mind, and certainly your prayers, the victims of the storm, and support those organizations and institutions that are providing much needed relief. So thank you very much. Now, having said that, we're here to celebrate a milestone, and that is the 10th anniversary of the creation of RPA. As many of you know, it was spun out of the Rockefeller family office 10 years ago, and the aim was to provide a much more thoughtful and effective approach to philanthropy to a much wider donor base. Now, over 10 years, have we been successful? We'd like to think we are. I can give you a few metrics that support that. We've gone from one location to now 4. We have offices in addition to New York. We have them in Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. We had 15 staff when we started out 10 years ago. We now have, Melissa, around 37. Those 37 have expertise in virtually every conceivable area of philanthropy that you might name. We also had 10 years ago approximately 75 clients. We now have over 150 families, individuals, foundations, and corporations. They have a giving profile which is quite interesting. This past year, they will have given in excess of $200 million worldwide, over 20 countries, and we take special pride in being able to advise, facilitate, and manage that level of giving on behalf of our client base. So it's a charge that we take very seriously and we're very proud of. Now, who do we thank for these 10 years of results and achievement? Three groups, frankly. First, those members of the Rockefeller family that were so prescient 10 years ago to create RPA. I'd like to cite 3 individuals, one of whom is here tonight, Stephen Rockefeller. Stephen. 2 other individuals that I'd like to recognize, Abby O'Neill and Eileen Growald, who is our founding chair as well. The second group I'd like to recognize, and that is our current and past board members and staff. They're a marvelous group, and without their wise advice and counsel, RPA would not be the organization that it is today. And the third group certainly is our clients. They've invested in us the charge to facilitate their giving worldwide, and it's a charge that we take very, very seriously and we're very proud of. So I hope, with all that in hand, that recognizing RPA's achievements, that you'll join me in wishing RPA many, many more years of providing what they say is thoughtful and effective philanthropy to a much wider donor base. So thank you very, very much for coming this evening. I have one more responsibility I might add, and that is to introduce Melissa Berman. Melissa, as you know, is our CEO and president, and she's provided very inspirational leadership. She's assembled a marvelous staff, and it's this team which is responsible for what RPA is today. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Melissa. Thank you very, very much again.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. For those of you who would like some more specific suggestions about how to help in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, RPA has some postings on the blog on our website, which is www.rockpod.org. We have quite a bit of information about the various food organizations in the tri-state area. We're putting together information about how to help the various heating and shelter centers that are being developed, and we're also pulling together information about how to help the homebound, the elderly, and those people who need special medical attention who are in difficult shape. And my colleagues and I would be happy to talk with anybody for more information after this session is over. But I want to get us into the panel discussion now. When this organization started 10 years ago, the idea of global philanthropy was a very vague concept. There were, and had been for many decades, of course, organizations, individuals, and families like the Rockefellers that had a global view of philanthropy. There had been philanthropists in countries in other places in the world, like José Antonio, who represents the third generation of his family in philanthropy. But the idea of global philanthropy as a system, as a community that we would all be part of, was really unheard of. And a lot has changed in those years. The number of events and publications, the spread of communications and events about philanthropy and global philanthropy around the world has just been phenomenal. And so what we want to start to think about is, how is it that this, so to speak, global culture of giving has been building, and where might it be going in the next 10 years? And we're lucky to have 3 people to talk with us about this who have just a phenomenal perspective on the subject. So starting from my far right, which may be your left, is José Antonio Alonso, who is the chairman and CEO of a private investment company based in Mexico, which he formed after he stepped down as the chairman and CEO of Quinta Hotels and Resorts, an organization that he built to prominence over many years in Mexico. He had also worked as the president of Grupo Esbalsa, which had retail franchises, and began his career in New York City at Chase. He is the president of the board of trustees of the Amparo Foundation, which his grandfather set up, very active in philanthropy across Mexico, one of the founding members of the Mexican Philanthropy Association. And he has contributed articles to major publications in places like the Washington Post and the New York Times. In the center is Stephen Rockefeller Sr., who is a professor emeritus of religion at Middlebury College, where he was also dean. He is the author or co-editor of several books and has published widely on issues regarding religion and global affairs. For the past 2 decades, he's been particularly active in the Earth Charter Initiative, which searches to find a consensus about how to create an ethical foundation for the emerging global community, a community that goes beyond philanthropy, of course. Professor Rockefeller has served as a trustee for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the National Audubon Society, Colonial Williamsburg, the Asian Cultural Council, and the Zen Center in Rochester, New York. And as you heard, he was a founding board member of our organization. And then to my immediate right is Wendy O'Neill, who has graciously agreed to step in for Marissa Fung Shaw, who sends her regrets. Marissa lives and works in Hong Kong and had planned to come to New York last week, and I'm sure you can imagine what didn't happen. She got as far as London before having to throw in the towel. Wendy chairs the board of the Asian Cultural Council and currently serves on the board of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And she is also on the board of the China Medical Board. She was a member of the American Women's Association of Hong Kong's Charitable Donations Committee for many of the years that she worked in Asia. She lived in Hong Kong for 12 years and Beijing for 3 years. She worked in trading and investment and was the first foreign intern at the China International Trust and Investment Company. So we have a tremendous perspective, wealth of experience, and I want to thank everybody for making the time to come and do this evening. So I would like to start by asking each of you to sort of say a little bit about what motivates you to be so involved in philanthropy and sort of what the major focus of your philanthropy is right now. May I ask you to start, Jose?
Sure. Thank you very much, Melissa. And congratulations on this 10 years. Thank you for having me here. And I think I became involved in philanthropy. I think the best way you can be involved, I was exposed to it since I was born, because my family, my mother, who was a true philanthropist, she was always concerned more for others than for herself. So she was always talking about, since I was 2 years old, and how is that person doing, and by her example, we were always know to appreciate what we had, and how to share that with others. No, she always told us, how can some people have such abundance of everything, and when there's others that don't have the essential in life. No, so that was something that I had the privilege of living with. And then my grandfather, who was also a true philanthropist, after being a very successful man in business in Mexico, decided in 1978 that he wanted to establish a foundation to work in 3 different areas. So one of them being education. And we have funded several universities, and we have our own community centers, a program designed by our foundation that works with small children since they're born. In Mexico, sadly, in some of rural areas, these women work as servants for houses, and they would leave sometimes their kids tied to their beds and some of them would die. And so it was. So we established these community centers where they would drop them. They had medical services, and when we received the kids, they were anemic. So we started feeding them, and then the necessities of the people that live around the centers became. We had the doctors not only tending the kids, but now their older brothers and the parents, because they didn't have anything else to do. So the centers now have become a place where we treat everybody, we feed everybody, and we try to educate. So one of those areas, besides just doing these grants to universities and individuals to attend colleges, was to create this program, these community centers in different areas. Another side that my grandfather established was the cultural side of the foundation, to rescue the greatness of Mexico, of its culture, and we established the Amparo Museum, which is regarded as the benchmark in museums in Mexico, has the most important pre-Columbian collection, that a private collection, and has been visited for several millions of people. We also, my mother started granting a recognition of the cultural, of the arts every year with an award that David Rockefeller won for many years ago, being the great philanthropy that he is. So the museum, we bring culture from other countries, from France, from Iran, from so many different countries, to expose the Mexicans to different cultures. And we also give courses on Mexican history and Mexican culture, and in trying to involve people in their great heritage that Mexico has. No? And on the other area that we work is on the immediate needs of people, no? And which is not really philanthropy by some, but it's some kind of, my grandfather used to tell me that's charity, so that's not philanthropy. But we do, because sometimes people are in immediate needs that you can't just look at it and don't do anything. No? So those are the 3 major areas, and that's why today it's my turn to be the chairman of the foundation, which is very to fill some very big shoes. No, but we're trying. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Stephen, please.
First of all, it's a honor and privilege to be here this evening with all of you and to serve on this panel as we celebrate the 10th anniversary of RPA. It is hard to believe that 10 years has passed, but I want to congratulate Kevin Broderick and the Board of Trustees and Melissa Berman and her wonderful staff for all they've accomplished in these 10 years. It was the Rockefeller family tradition in philanthropy that inspired and motivated me and provided me with all sorts of wonderful opportunities over the years to become involved in philanthropy. And I'm a fourth generation member of the Rockefeller family, and it was my grandfather, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was probably the most important influence in this regard growing up. And I would also add the whole Christian tradition of social ethics was also a very important influence. And we were taught as children that with great wealth and opportunity goes great social responsibility. And furthermore, that without caring, responsibility and creative leadership on the part of people who have the privilege of education, opportunity, and wealth, a free society is simply unsupportable. And I believe that very, very firmly. In terms of my own interests, I'm especially interested in the growing interdependence that we see in the world today. And a lot of my interest focuses on the far-reaching changes that we have to make in how we think, how we live, how we relate to one another, and how we relate to the larger living world of which we're all a part, if we're going to build just, sustainable, and peaceful communities locally and globally. And reflecting my own academic background in religion, philosophy, and ethics, one of my special interests has been this emerging new global consciousness in the world and the ethical and spiritual values that we need as a species, as a human species today, to make this great transition to a sustainable future. And the Earth Charter initiative has been at the center of my work in that area. Thank you.
Hi, and I'm, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I'm a fifth generation member of the Rockefeller family, so I'm going to talk about what Marissa Fung, who would have been here, her answer to this question, because I think mine would be too similar to Stephen's. And I think it's good to hear hers. And she's a good friend of mine. I hope she doesn't mind me doing this. And I did confer with her about what she thought. So she also comes from a family. Her father is Chinese, and her mother is from the Philippines. But they're a family of great service. They've worked service in the government, and they've also volunteered. They've established schools, libraries, all sorts of institutions, both in the Philippines, China, and Hong Kong. And so she came from a family where it was part of her DNA, that helping others was just part of her DNA. And she's a very creative and artistic person, and her father was involved with the Asian Cultural Council. And so she has been instrumental in Hong Kong in furthering the mission there. And the Asian Cultural Council does cultural exchange between Asia and the United States, and she thinks that artists have such an important role to play in society, and that we can help them achieve their potential. They can show us, push the boundaries of society and help us solve many of our problems. So I will put her down now.
Well done, Wendy.
Thank you. I wanted to ask the three of you why you think there is so much interest in philanthropy. Why interest in philanthropy is growing around the world. Why are there so many sort of conferences and seminars on philanthropy? So many of the private banks working to help their clients fulfill their missions in philanthropy. And in fact, even so much more attention in the media to philanthropy, which we really never saw before. The idea that a reporter would write an article about Jet Li's foundation, or even, or that reporters would write about the fact that George Lucas is going to, when he sells his company to Disney, start a multi-billion-dollar foundation with the proceeds. That kind of thing would not have been covered in the press until recently. Why do you think that is? Can I ask you, Wendy, to start?
Why? Well, I think in Asia, one reason why you're seeing more philanthropy is since World War II, the economic development has just been tremendous. So I think there is now wealth to give away, which wasn't as much the case. And I think many people that I just came back from Asia, spent 3 weeks there traveling around, that many people I think aspire to follow American philanthropists. They feel like they've made the money and now this is what they should do. So I think they're following the example of others in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Stephen?
Yes, I think Wendy's absolutely correct. A lot of this has to do with the new wealth that's being created in many countries around the world. And when you begin to create this wealth, you begin to ask yourself, what am I going to do with it? And I think that wealthy people increasingly find themselves asking the question that the great Jewish scholar and rabbi formulated centuries ago. If I'm not for myself, who will be? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? And I think more and more people are asking themselves that question when they look at two really big problems that face the world today. One is the growing gulf between the rich and the poor. And this is not only a deep ethical problem, it's also a threat to global stability, and it also is a threat of radical violence. And we see it all around the world. We have almost half the people in the world living on $2 a day or less, and the inequity and the inequality is a very, very serious problem. And the other is the environmental degradation. We've got one planet to live on. It's small, it's finite, the resources are gradually being consumed, and anybody who sits down and thinks about this for very long has got to realize that we are in the process of leaving a deeply degraded and damaged world to our children and future generations. So I think it's a combination of these factors, the global situation and the fact that this new wealth is being created. And there is, of course, the paradox that the very mechanisms that are creating the wealth today, the industrialization, the globalization, are the very same forces that are creating these very deep social problems. So people with money have a lot to think about, and I think more and more people are beginning to think creatively and responding in thoughtful and promising ways.
Thank you. No, I agree 100% with what Stephen and Amy just said. I would just add that I think also it has a lot to do with communications. Today, you can see what's happening on other parts of the world, in Haiti or Somalia, and I think there's a conscience of the people who can give. And again, with Stephen, I would agree that that people are concerned that there's disparity. I was just reading a book by Joseph Stiglitz, which is called The Price of Inequality, and of what's going on during the world. That's why you see all these things going out in Egypt or in the Middle East, and you could see it anywhere. No, it's because that gap is growing and growing, and there's people who don't have the essentials to live. No, I remember President Kennedy in his inaugural address. He said, if a free society cannot take care of their poor, it cannot save the few rich. So I think that's part of some of the answers of people that want to do something, not out of philanthropy, but just to be able to survive. No, thank you.
We hear this also when we talk to people, and the part about it that I worry about a little bit, honestly, is the premise seems to be that it's no longer the public sector that is going to be the ones to take care of the poor and provide the safety net, provide the protection of our environment, but that solving these problems is in the hands of, so to speak, the private sector and private philanthropy. And so that leads me to wonder, are the expectations that are being placed on philanthropy overstated and unreasonable, given that philanthropy is still even by the most optimistic projections, a small piece of the overall flows of capital and economic activity on the planet. Do you think it's overblown, or?
Well, the point you made, Melissa, is critical, that when you look at the flow of money going through civil society and the philanthropic sector, it's a very, very small piece of GDP and a very, very small piece of what is flowing through government. And this means that if philanthropy is going to be successful, it has to be concerned about influencing both the corporate sector and government policy, and it also has to build partnerships with government and the private sector if it's going to be able to promote the kind of change that is critical. And this is an open question today as to whether the visionaries working in the philanthropic sector are going to be able to gain the momentum and develop in civil society what is sometimes called a third force alongside of business and government that can be truly effective and get government and business to truly address these massive problems today.
What do you think? You've been in all of these sectors probably at one point or another in your career, right?
Yeah, no, I have to agree with Stephen, and I think there must be a way where we can find common ground with governments and corporations to coordinate our efforts and probably fund the initiatives that are working instead of creating independent efforts. As you know, the government is a terrible manager of anything, no? And so it would be better off to coordinate a common effort that's not managed by the government, but it's a real one of the most important questions towards the future of philanthropy. How are we going to address this?
No, I would agree. It has to be a partnership of business, government, and philanthropy.
I wanted to ask if you think there is really a global consensus developing among people who have resources. That is there a sort of common a global culture of giving, of thinking about some of these issues emerging, or do you still see it as fairly fragmented?
I don't know. I just came from Asia. I still think there's quite a bit of difference. I wouldn't even say there's an Asian culture of giving because there's such diversity. You have in the East very Confucian societies where big governments and the family really has been dominant, and other institutions have not played an important role. While there's 1 billion Muslims in Asia, I think we forget the majority of Muslims are in Asia, and they have a very strong charitable tradition. So each country and each society, I really think, has a different approach still. There's some very wealthy individuals, some of them who are educated in the West, who have brought back a more Western global concept of giving. But I still don't think it's quite there yet.
I think Wendy has raised some important questions, and I would be very cautious about using this notion of one global culture of giving. But I want to qualify that. And the first thing I want to say, and Wendy indicated this, is throughout the world there are many philanthropic traditions that in most cases are thousands of years old and are deeply rooted in humanity's religious and ethical traditions. So there's no question there's philanthropic traditions worldwide. All the world's great religions have taught almsgiving and charitable giving in support of the poor and the destitute, and also in support of one's religious community. Those are fairly universal values. At the same time, it's also true, as Melissa has indicated, that in many countries around the world, particularly those that are industrializing, where wealth is being created, like Brazil and Mexico and China and India and so forth, there is a lot of new philanthropic energy, many new philanthropic initiatives, and in addition, there is some cross-cultural dialogue and there is some collaboration. However, cultural diversity is a very fundamental value as we try to build a global community today. And in philanthropy, I think we need to recognize its importance. So to me, the ideal would be many cultures of giving all around the world with cross-cultural dialogue and some collaboration when it seems appropriate. And this is beginning to happen. But I would emphasize the diversity of traditions, and also we have a lot to learn from each other in this regard. And we can get into a further discussion about some of the Western traditions in strategic philanthropy. But that would be my perspective on this, Melissa.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Wendy and Stephen, and I think that even though that when you see the different continents and the consistent is they focus on education, on culture, so there's some common ground, no? Even though there's they tropicalize it to every different, but you see most of them focusing on health, education. So.
To what extent do you think there are universal values in either, as Stephen was indicating, that come out of religious and ethical traditions, or as some others have stated, that come out of just the fundamental biological wiring of human beings? There's this study which may or may not actually be science that suggests that the act of giving is as rewarding from the point of view of what lights up in your brain as eating chocolate. And that we are indeed sort of wired, to be good to one another. Do you think that how would you characterize those universals, and do they offer us something other than a sort of basis for mutual respect? Do they offer a basis for mutual action? So I'll give you the chance to go first, because you.
No, I think that's true, what you just mentioned, and during all my traveling around the world, you can see most people are noble. You see it in every continent, in every city, and they're all concerned of one another. No, I think you just need to, again, coordinate their efforts. And sadly, the majority of people are not in a position to take big initiatives. But I think with the right with the right leadership, you could establish different organizations to help different needs.
The basic universal is the human capacity for sympathy and empathy. We are wired so that we can identify with one another and with other sentient beings, animals and birds and other creatures that feel. And so sympathy, empathy, compassion, that's the fundamental universal, and it's expressed in the Golden Rule, which you find in all cultures throughout the world. And on a gut level, most people know it's basically true. We ought to respect each other and do unto others as we would like them to do to us. And it's formulated in lots of different ways. The Dalai Lama puts it very beautifully. He said all of Buddhism can be summarized: 2 simple teachings. Help others. And if you can't help them, leave them alone. Don't harm them. And and most people know that, this is solid wisdom. I mean, and when you try to apply it, it can get complex. But I think that's the basic universal, and that leads to charitable giving for people in need where there is suffering. And I think those are the kind of basic universals. And what happens as government develops, part of the job of creating the social safety net becomes a governmental responsibility, but people also continue to feel that charitable giving remains very important. And I think whatever you think of strategic philanthropy, the charitable giving is foundational.
Yeah, I think it's part of philanthropy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree.
And what you were saying about your own foundation.
Yeah.
I don't have much to add. I think they pretty much explained it. Yeah.
Where do you see the opportunity for philanthropy on a global basis to be the greatest? What issues or what ways of giving or what opportunities are you most optimistic about for philanthropy in the coming years?
Well, I guess some of our issues are so transnational, like the environment. And I still think disaster relief seems to be people respond to that very much. Social enterprise, these are all areas, and we have a lot to learn from each other. I don't know if you have any.
So Melissa, are you asking about the challenges as well as the opportunities, or?
I was going to do that separately, but please feel
so
free
you're-
to address both.
Yeah.
Challenge
yeah.
it, whichever.
Because I think the big challenge is philanthropy is rising around the world. In many developing nations, China would be a prime example, it's absolutely critical you get a good legal framework within which it functions, and that there is good governance. And the fact of the matter is, in most developing countries, there is not yet a good legal framework, and this would be very true of China. Only in 2004 in China, for example, did they make it legal for an individual to take the initiative in creating a foundation without government partnership and support and basically oversight. So building that legal framework is critical, and there is, of course, the danger when large amounts of money are pooled for abuse and corruption. And so these are basic challenges, and the whole practice of good governance and developing the art as well as the science of philanthropy, it's a challenge. It's not easy to do well. And that's where we need to help each other in the sharing of best practices. And I know, Melissa, you're very keen on trying to promote this as you work with various people. Yeah.
It's difficult to add anything, but no, I think there's a great opportunity because there's more and more people involved in philanthropy all over the world. I think it's important that that money doesn't go to waste, because some people are very creative and start things that are not going to work. So there's the role like RPA is playing in helping some people to establishing what's the correct way to give. You know? So I hope that more and more enthusiasts of philanthropy come to the right to people like you, Melissa, and your organization that have the experience of what works and what doesn't work, no? And as well as probably, I don't know if a global philanthropy forum or something like that comes together, so the efforts are not individual and you don't have to reinvent the wheel for many organizations. It's pretty important, no?
We promised that part of our session today would give you an opportunity to ask our panelists questions, so I'm going to turn the floor over to you. I did threaten, and not in an idle manner, that those who hung in the back would be called on if hands don't go up. So I'm wondering who would like to be brave enough to ask the first question. Renee, thank you. Can you just say who you are, please, and where you're from?
My name is Renee Dubois. I'm from Chicago, and I work for William Blair & Company, and I'm RPA's biggest fan. I do have a question about the government-private partnerships, realizing that would be more difficult in a global perspective. But are you familiar with, and can you opine on the social impact bonds? For example, in Ohio, somebody got together and made a deal with the state to provide health care to inmates, and if it was successful, the state would pay them, otherwise the investors were out. What's the outlook for a program like that?
I know that stuff. I got that. I'll take this one, okay? Last year I was at a conference on philanthropy. Apparently that's all I do. And there was a guy from, I don't know, West Virginia or Virginia, I'm sorry to say, I don't remember which, and he said, I'm the chair of the board of a major social services organization. We've gone into one of the most difficult low-income housing centers, you know, that the county operates in my community. And we've developed all of these programs, you know, that start from parenting classes and then go all the way up to helping the elderly stay in their apartments. And the amount of money that it's saving the state for, keeping kids from getting sick and ending up in emergency rooms, and keeping the elderly from having to be in nursing homes that are funded by Medicare, keeping kids out of jail, keeping kids off drugs. It's a phenomenal amount of money. And we don't get a penny of that. Instead, we're putting all this money into it, and the state is going to save the money in the end. And so that was a very, I thought, elegant and passionate way to describe the premise for the social impact bonds, which is to try and connect the people who were putting the money up and where the benefit comes, right? And we see those kinds of disconnections in lots of things. I mean, how many of us live in buildings in the city where somebody says, let's have a green roof? And the building management says, yeah, great, we pay for the green roof and you guys get lower utility bills, no thank you. And that's just a mismatch of who's making the investment and who's getting the savings, right? And so this is a way to try. We've all heard for decades, and those of us who work in this field, if you invest something like $1 in the nurse family partnerships, overall the savings to society are $4. So let's match up the people who are putting that $1 in and the people who are in the $4, right? So that's a liberal arts explanation. How's that? There's a piece of both, Peter, because by and large, the benefits are going back to a nonprofit organization. In most cases, in rare cases, are they going to a bond holder. In the UK, they're trying to do it for a bond holder, but I think by and large, some people who are not fans of it simply refer to it as pay for performance for nonprofits. Anybody else want to comment on social impact bonds in the audience? Okay. Next question, please. Jason, thank you. Mm-hmm. Right.
Which generation does that mean? But I think one of the curious things in the context of global philanthropy is there's extensive conversation about next generation philanthropy in the U.S. And it's a relatively new experience in many other parts of the world with outside Western Europe, with a westernized view of philanthropy. So I'm curious, especially Mexico and Hong Kong, your experiences in both, or any of your experiences globally, how do you see the differences of generational engagement in philanthropy in a global context?
Can you start, José Antonio, talk a little, maybe a little more about your family and what you see in the communities that you're active in?
Exactly. Well, I think, as I mentioned before, we're on our third generation of giving. The prior two generations were a totalitarian regime, no? where first my grandfather and then my mother had, they decided whatever was going. I don't know if this is what you meant by the next generation in the foundations, but what we're dealing now in our foundation is what to do next, no? And our solution was to try to institutionalize the foundation, bringing other board members to the table and trying to work with all the best practices and that is very complicated because of the involvement of some of the family members at some of the programs, which can be good or bad, no? But I think for the long term, it's better to have run it like an institution and have some limited involvement of the family members.
Have you and your siblings started thinking about what would be the fourth generation, your children,
Exactly.
nieces and nephews?
Yes, and we're thinking about it in partially at the board level, not involved in managing any programs, and having a plural board, that if the family is going to have 50% of the board seats, we can have the other 50 by respectable other members. So, but it's tough, it's difficult, and the previous experience that we were used to a totalitarian regime, then obviously somebody wants to keep it that way, no? And so I don't know if that's addressing what you mentioned.
Do you hear other families in Mexico talking about the issue of transmitting philanthropic values to the next generation? Is that on people's minds?
Yes, I think more and more the example that the U.S., I think one of your previous questions, that Bill and Melinda Gates foundations and other foundations have given, some people had never thought of giving have started the idea of doing something. And frankly, the idea that when you give everything to your children, you practically don't allow them to develop fully. And this idea that you should only spend whatever you have managed to make, no? And that you can, the funds that you've worked so hard for, or the wealth that you accumulated, can benefit so many, instead of, so yes, you see that. And now the question is whether you want to have a family foundation that's run out of the ideas of first the family, or you want to institutionalize it. So, and most people in Mexico have a family-run foundations. Yeah.
Thank you. Wendy, what do you see in here in Hong Kong and China?
In Hong Kong, it's been an issue that people want to see the next generation step up, and I think it's also true in other countries like Japan, Korea, and Singapore and such, where they develop much earlier. For instance, China is only now just starting to make money. So it definitely came up recently when I was on my trip, and they're all trying to see how to engage the next generation, and I think the next generation is a bit more global. Many of them educated in the West, and they're also maybe a bit more impact-oriented and a little bit more media savvy. So I can see changes starting to happen. Yeah. Stephen?
I'll just give you one interesting example. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund has been conducting a dialogue with a number of very successful entrepreneurs in China. And a year ago, we had the first meeting outside New York at the conference center that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund runs. And there were 5 or 6 very wealthy men and women who came. But what was particularly striking to me is they brought many of their children. And this was especially important to them because they wanted to understand family philanthropy. And in China, there is, of course, a very strong ethic in this Confucian tradition of responsibility to one's family. But this was right at the center of their interest as they came to talk with us, both about how to set up foundations, how to develop goals and strategies and manage them and so forth. But they were particularly interested is how do you transmit this tradition from one generation? And as Wendy said, what was also striking is most of the young people who came were all here in universities in the United States. And one of them, a young man who was getting his PhD at Cornell, was in the midst of developing a new system for fracking that wasn't going to use water and chemicals. And I mean, brilliant work, and we may all be hearing about this in the near future. So there is a lot going on, I think, in many of these cultures around this, certainly in China. This is very much on the minds of the people creating these new foundations.
Other questions? One more. Corey? I know you're sitting in the front, but I thought I would call on you anyway.
And yet, I look at the world today, religions in conflict.
Yeah.
And how do you think about, you know, the optimism that you have for philanthropy, you know, in a world that seems to be right now in such turmoil?
Yeah, yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, go. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I'll give you the answer that I used to give to my students at Middlebury College. When we would go through the environmental degradation and the social issues and problems that face the world, many students would get really depressed and discouraged. And my answer to them was this, and this came out of my experience with the Earth Charter for 10 years, traveling all over the world, negotiating shared values and meeting with all sorts of extraordinary people. And this is what I said to them. All over the world, there are extraordinary women and men doing truly remarkable, wonderful things. You have a choice. You can sit here depressed and discouraged, and you know exactly what's going to happen in the world. Or you can go out and join them. And there's no way of knowing what's going to happen. Nobody predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nobody predicted that apartheid would come down without a bloody revolution. And there are many examples like this where we can't really imagine what is happening. I believe that there is a new global consciousness emerging that is particularly evident among young people as you travel around the world. A new global consciousness which involves a deep sense of respect for human rights, an awareness of the environmental issue, a new sense of belonging to the larger community of life. That generation needs to be empowered. But the problems are huge. But I think all we can do is go out and join the wonderful, extraordinary people who are doing a lot of good things in the world. It's a dangerous situation we're in. But if you allow yourself to be paralyzed by fear, it's all over. And I also believe that even if you're defeated, if you do what you believe is right, that's what counts.
No, I think the good news is that everybody knows that things have gotten so bad that they're unsustainable. And we're looking at this all over the world. And so I don't think this has anything to do with philanthropy, but with survival, as I was saying before. If we don't do something, this is going to end badly for everybody. So I think that more and more people are conscious of this, and they're taking, they're doing some changes out of survival, and these people need to hook up with institutions such as all the foundations that have been trying to address these issues that of the great disparities that we see all over the world, no? And even in the U.S., no? There's the numbers that the book that I mentioned before, of the price of inequality, they're very concerning. No? The middle class in this country has been reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced. So, and the 1% rich people in the U.S. have become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, and the greed of what today is being called competitiveness, of moving jobs elsewhere and on the basis of competitiveness, has really endangered the middle class in the U.S. And I'm just saying the U.S. as a benchmark worldwide, but is really worrisome. But on the other hand, I think we are at the bottom of the curve, and people are starting to realize that we need to get together to start to creating a bigger mass, no, or spreading the wealth better.
I think they've said it all.
Could I add one, Melissa, could I add one thing? I want to share with you something that happened when we were celebrating the 150th anniversary of John D. Rockefeller Sr. in 1989. And it was a 3-day event, and at the end of it, 300 people gathered together in a large auditorium space, and Hannah Gray, the president of the University of Chicago, was moderating. And for 3 days, people had been sharing all their ideas about how to address the problems of the world. And she asked for comments, and Bill Moyer stood up. And he had been there for 3 days, visiting one session after another, And he had never said a word. And he stood up, and this is what he said. He said, I've been here for 3 days, and I've been listening to all of you and these extraordinary, wonderful visions you have for the future. But nobody, he said, has discussed the media. And let me tell you something. If you don't get the media behind what you want to achieve and use the media effectively, there's no way you're going to achieve any of these things. And that today means also the internet, and it means the social media. And as we're trying to build this third force in civil society today, this is really critical. And it's a younger generation that's going to do it. I mean, I don't understand that whole world. And I know it's potent and powerful, and I'm impressed again and again when I hear what can be done. I mean, several $1 billion was raised in 2004 in small gifts using cell phones to make gifts from people around the world. I mean, it's remarkable what can be done. But anyway, I think that what Bill said on that occasion is something we all need to keep in mind.
Thank you. Okay, Michael, last question.
Sure. Michael Braun, I run a multifamily office, and I'm just curious, Melissa, about the amount of due diligence, the kind of due diligence you guys are doing for the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
I find that many of my older clients were very happy to write the big checks to universities,
Right.
hospitals, all the big old traditional places
Right.
to give.
Right.
The next generation, where they have a whole different expectation of accountability,
Right.
transparency, all
Right.
of that. And are you seeing that as well?
Sure, we certainly see that as well, Michael. And I think once you get out as a donor, once you get out of the safety zone of institutions like the one where we're fortunate enough to be having the event this evening, you're often in a world where you don't have a level of certainty whether or not you're the kind of donor who wants additional measures of accountability. I think many nonprofits are struggling to meet the new demands. I think in many cases, some of the demands that are being placed on the nonprofits are frankly not quite fair because often every bright and thoughtful person has a different set of questions that they require a set of answers to. And you can, literally find yourself in a situation on the board of an organization that needed to file a 20-page report for a grant of $2,500. How the whole sector is going to adapt to this wonderful both opportunity where we have new forms of philanthropy emerging, new philanthropists who are interested in doing different and innovative things, new and innovative nonprofits that are trying new models like social enterprise, but we don't yet have a good enough system to efficiently and responsibly match the supply and the demand and track the results. That's the work. That's the work that we all have to, put our minds to over the coming years. So I want Marnie. Okay, go ahead. Marnie, go ahead. You have to say who you are. Mm-hmm.
And where is that leading us? I sometimes think it's leading us in circles.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking at ourselves and not out at the world.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be interested in any of the panelists, or Melissa, if you want, you've done some work on this subject, but to me it's an issue that we need to be more thoughtful about and not get stuck on.
Right, right. Does anybody want to comment on that, or?
This is about evaluation, impact assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is critical if you have a foundation to have a system of regular review of your grant making and ways of conducting impact assessment. Measurable indicators work in certain cases, but often they don't. And I think it's important to remember that philanthropy is not just a science, it's also an art. And a lot of it has to do with good judgment, and if you are trying to resolve problems that require long-term strategies, you have to also be patient. and you have to be willing to experiment and make mistakes, and then learn for them and correct yourself. But I do think it's important to recognize that measurable indicators are only part of the answer, and you'll never, if you're working in the world of strategic philanthropy, be able to reduce everything to some quantifiable answer. And this is frustrating in some ways. But I think here is where good judgment comes. And in this regard also, I think it's very important not to look in the developing world, to look to experts that are scholars of philanthropy and universities to solve all these problems. What you need is people coming out of the business world and other domains and spheres of human endeavor who can bring the creativity and the imagination and the good judgment they've learned into the philanthropic world. So I think it's, judgment and art is part of this.
Martin, I'm also very transparency and measuring things. So we tried at the Amparo Foundation, when we do uncharted work like the community centers, to start creating our own benchmarks and our own, because there's nothing else to measure up against. So that has worked for us, and since this community center have been for 20 years, now every new one, it has to establish to those benchmarks, since we don't have others, no? But we're always looking what better way to measure up. Huh?
Professor Rockefeller quoted the great scholar and philosopher Rabbi Hillel, and I would like to quote the great philosopher and scholar Yogi Berra, who said, if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. And I think a great deal of the confusion around this whole issue of evaluation, accountability, impact, measurement, simply is a matter of starting with the question, what problem are you trying to solve? And therefore, what do you want to measure? If the problem you're trying to solve, if you define that problem as there's no school building here and I'd like there to be a school building here, if that's the problem you're trying to solve, your problem is over when the building goes up. If the problem you're trying to solve is children are not getting educated, putting up the building does not actually solve the problem. It's a great milestone along the way, right? So there's accountability, which is I'm going to build the school for $1 million. Did you spend $1 million, $2 million, or what? But that's not the same thing as has anybody learned anything here. So, Allison.
I'm Allison Rockefeller, and I am a fifth-generation member of the family and the mother of 3 sixth-generation members. And I just want to thank so much Kevin and Melissa for your incredible service at RPA. I'm also RPA client. I created a fund to take the 200,000 disused gas stations in the United States and try to help convert them into community centers in Upton Park. It's my first park. And also founded the Women in Conservation Program at National Water Block. But RPA has been a vehicle for my own philanthropy, and I have an office there, and it's been a very big part of my life.
Yeah, great.
And I really appreciate it so much. And then from a family member, I just want to say on Stephen that I remember 10 years ago when you were so influential in the formulation of this enterprise.
Right.
And it's members of family like you that have really set a foundation for members of the family like me. And I can't thank you enough for that.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for saying that. That's lovely. Thank you. So our time is up, and I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your not only busy lives, but in the wake of this hurricane, your increasingly chaotic life. I would like to ask you to please join me in thanking our wonderful, wonderful panelists. I'd also like you to join me in thanking my terrific colleagues who put this event together and who were not intimidated by storm, floods, lack of power, and used telegraph lines to put lists together. So please join me in thanking the RPA team.